It's about time for Canadians to rise up and start roaring.
Let's go! Let's go!
I'm talking about peaceful resolution. I'm not talking about guns and swords.
Oh, hi, everybody. I'm back in Canada. I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil for a day and a half, but I learned a lot about freedom and how precarious it is and how governments, in the name of justice, can silence people. You'll remember when I was down there, a lot of people were talking about the censorship of Twitter. More than 20 million people in Brazil use that social media app, or at least until they did, until a rogue judge just banned it, saying there was misinformation in it. A lot of people were talking about Elon Musk and hoping he would fight back for them, but the judge isn't bending the knee. What does that have to do with Canada, you might ask? Well, everything, I think. First of all, every would-be tyrant around the world is watching what Brazil is doing and thinking if they can get away with the same thing in the name of misinformation. That's the new way of saying things I don't like to hear. Trudeau, as you know, has brought forward Bill C-63, called the Online Harms Act, that wouldn't censor Twitter as a whole, although there are huge fines in there for the company of Twitter, but would censor individual users like has been done in Brazil as well. I think that freedom of speech is undone in similar ways, though. It's never called censorship. It's always called defending the peace or public health. And that's the case today. Artur Pawlowski, who we've talked about 100 times at Rebel News, it's his appeal we're attending today. See, 2.5 years ago, Arthur went down to the Coutts border blockade between Alberta and the state of Montana. It was a small town, but it had a big footprint. It totally sealed off the border because unlike other blockades in Windsor, the Ambassador Bridge, or in Ottawa, Coutts, Alberta is so far away from any large center, there's no local big police force that could sort of push it away. No tow truck drivers were willing to tow their local community members. And so that blockade got a lot of attention and it inspired a lot of people. It, in fact, broke the back of the lockdown movement in Alberta shortly after the Coutts blockade ended. Jason Kenney, the premier at the time, announced the end of his vaccine passport scheme, for example. The police arrested a lot of people down there. And as you know, the Democracy Fund is defending many of them. But one of the people they went after was Artur Pawlowski, not for blocking the road, but for inspiring the men. Arthur didn't even spend a full day down there. He went down for a few hours. He drove through a police checkpoint with their approval down to Coutts, and he didn't go to the blockade, he didn't go to the road, he didn't go to the border itself. He went to the local saloon where the men had gathered. That's sort of where they were hanging out and getting their food and drink, and it was so cold down there, that's where they stayed warm. And Arthur got up and he gave an impromptu, I think it was a 17-minute sermon, basically telling his own story about being a freedom-fighting pastor, telling the story about the solidarity movement that was Lech Walensa's freedom-oriented trade union in the Gdansk shipyard that really lit the fire for the freedom movement in Poland that marked the end of the Soviet bloc. So Arthur talked about what he learned in Poland. He talked about that general strike. He talked about being peaceful but freedom fighting. He said 3 times in his sermon, if I recall, stay peaceful.
It's about time for Canadians to rise up and start roaring.
Let's go! Let's go!
I'm talking about peaceful resolution. I'm not talking about guns and swords. You see, this image right here, it was the most powerful thing I could ever do. And it went viral all over the world because it showed simply me on my knees in the middle of the highway being taken by SWAT team. Why? For inciting people to come to church, participating in illegal church gathering, and officiating a church service. Who do those people think they are?
Yeah. But the police reviewed that 17-minute sermon and charged him with inciting mischief. And there was a trial in Lethbridge, and we covered it closely, and he was convicted. And imagine the precedent that sets. If you can convict someone for a sermon, now you could call anything a sermon, I suppose. If someone says go and commit terrorism, I mean, you might actually have a sermon in a radical mosque saying that, but that's not what Arthur said. You can watch the video for yourself. It's on Facebook to this day. If you simply say, hold the line, retake your rights, be peaceful, if anyone could be convicted and jailed for that, there was a jail sentence attended to that, then we're all in trouble, including political commentators and any one of us. That's how bad it is in Brazil, and that's the new state of the law in Alberta. Right now, that is the state of the law, which is why we've come here to the Court of Appeal today. This isn't actually the normal building for the Court of Appeal, but this is where the hearing is today. A 3-judge panel will review this for 2 full hours. And I am hopeful that they will overturn this conviction now that more sober-minded senior judges are looking at it and that our lawyer, Sarah Miller, is on the case. It's a 2-hour hearing. There's no new evidence. There will be no witnesses testifying. It'll simply be lawyers on both sides showing the judge. For example, Sarah Miller, Artur Pawlowski's lawyer, will show the judge where the lower court made errors and say to these 3 senior judges, look, you got the law wrong, you got the facts wrong, let's fix it. And the Crown prosecutor is sending a lawyer saying, no, the lower judge got it right. This was a proper conviction. I'm hopeful if Alberta still has any of its Alberta-ness and its freedom-loving nature, that this 3-person appeal panel, including former boxer Willie DeWitt, will still stand for freedom. I can't imagine a Canada where if a pastor gives a sermon to men and repeatedly calls for peaceful protest, that pastor is jailed. That is so abnormal. That was the mania of the times during the lockdown, but surely in the several years since then, we've come to our senses and realized that the state had massive overreach. I'm sorry, I do not want to live in a country where a Christian pastor is picked off and jailed for saying, hold the line. By the way, show me the last time a Muslim imam was arrested for actually inciting violence. Hasn't happened in Canadian history. Anyways, this is my commentary before I go into the courts. I will be live tweeting today. I've spoken with Sarah Miller, Arthur's lawyer. She's agreed to do an interview after the hearing. If we see Arthur himself, we'll talk to him too. This is an important battle for Rebel News viewers. We have been supporting Arthur really since the very first day of the lockdowns. I remember he was client number 1 of what we then called the Fight the Fines campaign. He was the very first person we decided to help when he was pushed around and given a ticket for feeding the hungry homeless in the streets of Calgary. Remember that video? This is the video that started it all. A Christian pastor in the cold handing out food to the indigent, and police coming and saying, hey, this is an illegal gathering. Take a look at this.
We are providing necessities of life to those that you and your bosses refuse to provide.
If you're breaking his rights, he's allowed to
stand back from you a little bit. I need 8 feet.
Whoa.
I need 8 feet. Stand back. Okay?
Or what?
Stand
You're gonna
back.
fucking threaten me and abuse me?
Hey, guys,
Do not do that.
Tell him not
6
to
feet
touch
away.
me.
6 feet away for
Back up
everybody.
now.
That's for everybody.
That video caused me to phone up Arthur and say, let me crowdfund your legal defense. And soon we had another pastor who was prosecuted for the same thing. And then we had 50 cases, and then 100. And then the Democracy Fund was created and to this day has helped 3,000 people. But we're still here for client number 1, who is actually in some ways being the most pesky of the clients because he just won't obey edicts. I guess that's the Polish nature in him. He's a contrarian, he's a dissident, and he doesn't shut up just because the government tells him to. That's a tough road to follow. The Democracy Fund has gone on to defend other people too, including Tamara Leach. I'll be in Ottawa for her trial again on Friday, if you can imagine. So here we are, years after the trucker convoy, and we're still fighting the legal battles emanating therefrom. But I think, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the universe, the moral arc, bends towards freedom. It just takes a very long time. I'll catch up with you after the hearing.